In 1931, the Rio Grande Southern's mighty steam trains, once the lifeblood of Colorado's mountains, were bleeding the railroad dry, each mile costing more than a week's wages, with entire towns facing starvation if the mail stopped. Locals laughed when a desperate mechanic rolled out a battered sedan welded to rail wheels. They called it a car on rails, too ridiculous to save anything. Yet while the giants rusted in their sheds, this oddball contraption was about to take on winter, blizzards, and bankruptcy, all while hauling hope into the mountains. What happened next would decide whether the railroad, and the communities clinging to it, lived or died. Receivership meant every dollar was counted and every mile of track was a liability. The Rio Grande Southern's ledgers from 1931 read more like a list of last chances than a business plan. Steam engines, once the pride of the mountains, had become a financial anchor dragging the railroad under. Payroll sheets showed at least 5 men required for every run: engineer, fireman, conductor, and 2 brakemen. Each trip demanded tons of coal, gallons of water, and hours of maintenance just to haul a handful of passengers and the daily mail. The balance sheet bled red ink, as the cost to move a single train mile soared while the revenue from freight and tickets evaporated. Court-appointed receiver Victor Miller issued orders that cut deep. 30% was cut from all expenses, no exceptions. Crews shrank, maintenance was deferred, and the roundhouse fell silent except for the rare whistle of a locomotive sent out only when absolutely necessary. The railroad's lifeline, the mail contract, came with a warning from the Interstate Commerce Commission. Miss a delivery and the government could pull the contract. No mail meant no cash, and no cash meant the end of the line for every town along the route. The numbers did not lie. Every time a steam locomotive left the yard, the railroad lost money. The cost per mile, wages, coal, water, and repairs outstripped the shrinking payments from the post office. The company's own ledgers showed it. Running a full train for a bag of mail and 3 passengers was madness. The Interstate Commerce Commission's threat hung over every decision. If service lapsed, abandonment proceedings would follow, and the rails would be torn up for scrap. With the mines closed and the depression deepening, there was nothing left to haul except hope, bundled inside the mail sacks that arrived each morning. On paper, the Rio Grande Southern was finished. But in the back shops at Ridgeway, where the ink stains of the ledger met the sweat of the mechanic, a different kind of calculation was about to begin. In the shadow of the San Juan peaks, the towns clung to life by a single fragile thread of steel. Telluride and Rico depended on the daily arrival of the train, not just for letters or news from the outside, but for the things that kept people alive. Every sack of flour, every crate of canned goods, every bottle of medicine, none of it reached these mountain valleys except by rail. The postmaster's keys unlocked more than mailbags. They unlocked pay packets for miners still hoping for work, government checks that kept families fed, and the rare packages that brought a hint of comfort to homes battered by the Depression. When the train didn't come, the world shrank fast. Shelves in the general store emptied. The bank waited on the next shipment of currency. The doctor's office counted pills, knowing new supplies might not arrive for weeks if the rails went silent. Snow could close the wagon roads for months at a time. The telephone lines were no match for the wind and ice. Only the railroad, battered as it was, could promise a connection to the outside. Children watched the tracks for the distant echo of a whistle. Merchants swept their stoops, eyes fixed on the bend where the train should appear. The sound of a locomotive meant hope, a chance that the mail had arrived, that overdue bills could be paid, that families separated by miles of wilderness might hear from loved ones. Without the train, the towns felt abandoned, left behind by a country too busy to notice their struggle. Every missed delivery carried a cost measured not in dollars, but in empty stomachs and unanswered letters. The threat of losing the railroad wasn't just a matter of business, it was the difference between survival and silence. For the people of these mountains, the fate of the railroad was the fate of the town, and as winter drew closer, their need became desperate. a need that no steam engine, no matter how grand, could afford to answer anymore. Jack Odenbohr stood in the Ridgway shop, sleeves rolled, ledger open to a page that screamed in red ink. The order from above was blunt: build something cheap, or the railroad dies. He stared at the battered Buick Master Six parked out back, a car most folks would have written off as scrap. But Jack saw a lifeline. He kept the engine, the dash, even the front seats. The steering wheel was gone. No need for it when the rails decide where you're headed. He and his crew cut the rear body away, leaving the Buick nose perched on a new steel frame. The old road wheels were swapped for flanged steel, custom fit to the narrow gauge track. Every piece was measured twice, not for perfection, but to make sure it would not fall apart on the first run. The male did not care about elegance, so Jack built for survival. He welded a heavy cowcatcher to the front, cut from boilerplate scavenged from a retired locomotive. The boxy mail bed on the back came from whatever lumber and steel the shop could spare. Bolts, braces, and patches gave the whole machine the look of a limousine that lost a bar fight with a boxcar. The price tag for the experiment was $850. That was less than the cost of running a single steam train for a week. Forrest White, the superintendent, kept his distance at first, but he signed off on every supply slip and made sure no one in the office got in Jack's way. The shop records from June 1931 show a blur of overtime and improvisation. One day, mounting the drive shaft, the next rigging the brakes with whatever parts fit. There was no blueprint, just Jack's instinct and the urgency of a railroad on the edge. When the last bolt was tightened, the crew stepped back and stared. It wobbled, it rattled. But when Jack fired up the Buick engine, the whole shop listened. The car on rails was ready to gamble everything on a single run. The machine Jack Odenbohr rolled out of the Ridgway shops was no ordinary rail car. At first glance, it looked like a Buick sedan that had been mugged by a scrap heap, battered hood, steel wheels, a cowcatcher that belonged on a full-sized locomotive. But underneath, every decision was a calculated answer to a railroad's last hope. The heart of the Goose was its gasoline engine, 6 cylinders straight from the Buick. Instead of burning coal by the ton, it sipped fuel that could be bought at any filling station in town. A single tank could carry the mail from Ridgway to Dolores and back for pennies per mile. The drive shaft, once meant to spin rubber tires, was adapted to power a rail truck. Custom couplings and chain reduction gearing matched the engine's output to the steel wheels, letting the Goose crawl up steep grades and tiptoe across bridges the steamers would have battered to splinters. Weight was everything. The Goose tipped the scales at just 6 tons, light enough to cross rotting trestles and sagging rails without shaking them apart. Where a steam locomotive pounded the track with every wheel, the Goose glided, its pivoting trucks hugging the sharp curves and uneven joints of the mountain line. Less weight meant less wear, and less wear meant the railroad could keep running even as maintenance budgets vanished. Crew size shrank from a full team to just one man. The driver did it all. He ran the throttle, braked for every crossing, loaded the mail, and punched the tickets. No fireman, no brakeman, no conductor. Just a single operator in the front seat, watching the rails wind through the canyons. That cut labor costs to the bone, turning what had been a money-losing run into something the railroad could actually afford. On paper, the Goose's spec sheet was almost comical. A luxury car's engine, a homemade frame, a box bolted on the back. But when you compared it to the steam giants rusting in the roundhouse, the numbers told the truth. One man, 6 tons, gasoline by the gallon, not the ton, and a fuel bill so low it barely made a dent in the ledger. The real test would come on the line, but in the shop, the logic was simple and sound. Build a machine light enough to save the rails, cheap enough to save the company, and simple enough that anyone with a wrench could keep it running. Winter on the Rio Grande. Southern did not wait for permission. The first snow could bury the rails overnight, turning every trip into a test of grit and luck. For the man at the throttle, there was no crew to back him up, just a battered toolkit wedged behind the seat and a portable jack rated for 8 tons rattling on the floorboards. The Goose was too light to bully its way through drifts, so the flanger blade, a steel wedge bolted beneath the frame, scraped snow and ice just inches above the rails. Most days, that was enough. But when the snow piled higher, the only option was to stop, grab a shovel, and clear a path by hand. Derailments came without warning. The track twisted through rock cuts and over-sagging trestles, and frost heaves could lift a rail just enough to send the Goose's steel wheels hopping off the line. There was no rescue train waiting. The operator would haul out the jack, muscle the front end back onto the rails, and check for damage before climbing back into the cab. Sometimes the only warmth came from the engine block, the smell of gasoline and sweat filling the tiny compartment. Every mile was a gamble. One man, one machine, and a mountain's worth of hazards. Mail did not care about excuses. If the Goose did not make it through, neither did the paychecks or medicine for the towns up ahead. Each run chipped away at both nerves and metal, but the alternative was silence on the rails, a risk no one in these mountains could afford. Snow hammered the line all night, piling drifts higher than the Goose's hood. The morning schedule wasn't a suggestion, it was a promise. The motorman wiped frost from the windshield and checked the cargo, sacks of mail, a crate of medicine, a few parcels for the store. With a gloved hand, he twisted the ignition. The Buick engine coughed, caught, and rattled to life. No one else was coming. The steam engines were locked in the roundhouse, too heavy for the buried rails. Only the Goose had a chance. The first mile vanished under the steel wheels, the horn's sharp cry echoing through pine and snow. At every drift, the Goose slowed. The motorman grabbed his shovel, boots crunching through the crust, clearing a path by hand. Fingers numb, he muscled the Goose back onto the rails after a hidden switch threw the front truck sideways. No time for complaints. The mail had to get through. The telegraph at Rico tapped out a question. Train delayed. The reply came from the postmaster's log. Motor arrived, on time, all mail delivered. In the general store, shelves filled back up. The doctor's office restocked. A child tore open a letter from a father working in Denver. The Goose's horn sounded again, not as a joke, but as relief. That battered, honking machine had done what the mighty steamers could not. Through wind, snow, and silence, it brought the world back to the mountains. One run, one shovel, one determined driver at a time. The first Goose proved its worth in the snow and on the balance sheet, but it was never meant to be the end of the story. As soon as the Ridgway shop saw what a single car on rails could do, the crew got to work expanding the fleet. They started with another Buick, but it was not long before Pierce Arrow limousines, cast-offs from the last days of luxury, became the new backbone. The shopmen pulled out the straight 8 engines and mounted them on frames built to take the worst the mountains could throw at them. Each new Goose got a little better, with enclosed mail compartments to keep parcels dry, stronger boxes for rough freight, and even a third truck under the longest bodies so they could snake around hairpin curves without binding up. The upgraded mail spaces kept the lifeline moving in weather that would have stopped bigger trains. Aluminum bus bodies shaved off precious weight and let the machines carry more passengers without beating the rails to death. By 1933, the price tag for Goose number 5 reached $2,599, but every dollar went to survival, more power, more capacity, fewer breakdowns. The Ridgway crew did not just copy the first Goose. They adapted, welded, and swapped parts until the fleet was a rolling catalog of Depression-era ingenuity, each machine a little less ugly and a lot more reliable than the last. The old rails of the Rio Grande Southern have long since vanished from the mountain valleys, but the geese refuse to disappear. Today, their battered bodies and honking horns still echo across Colorado and beyond, each one a living reminder of survival and of what desperation and ingenuity can build. Goose number 2 rolls out every summer at the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, its Pierce Arrow nose and patched mailbox gleaming under the high plains sun. Down in Dolores, Goose number 5 draws crowds to the depot, running special trips for visitors who want to ride in the same seats that once carried miners and mailbags through the San Juans. Goose number 3 escaped the Rockies altogether, finding new life at Knott's Berry Farm in California, where it still rattles along rails in the shadow of roller coasters and orange groves. Even Goose number 1, scrapped before the railroad died, returned in spirit, a faithful replica built at Ridgeway, restored to the same oddball proportions and ready for another run. These machines, once mocked as junkyard oddities, now stand polished and proud in museums and towns that remember what they meant. The geese outlasted the railroad that built them, carrying not just mail, but a story worth preserving. Today, most of the Galloping Geese survive, preserved not for beauty, but for proof that necessity still breeds invention. As supply chains strain and communities face new uncertainties, the lesson endures. The answers that save us often start as punchlines. Ingenuity doesn't always look heroic, until everything depends on it. What does your world laugh at now? That might just keep it running tomorrow.